What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is spirituality? Spirituality. Spirituality. How do they diver? How do they diver? How do they diver? How do they convert? How do they convert? How do they convert? How are we different? How are we different? How are we different? How are we the same? How are we the same? How are we the same? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is spirituality? Spirituality.
Hello, this is Angelo John Lewis for the Diversity and Spirituality Network podcast. In case you're not familiar with us, the Diversity and Spirituality Network is an emerging community who are exploring the integration of diversity and spirituality. Now, all of us in the network have different opinions as to what that looks like, but for me personally, I see diversity as nothing less than a sacred path in and of itself. If you'd like to know more about us, please visit our website, diversityandspirituality.com. Today, I'm delighted to interview Paul Zelizer, the founder and chief entrepreneurial activist of Awarepreneurs, which is a vibrant community of people who integrate entrepreneurship, social activism, and inner awareness practices. Paul is also a business and marketing coach who focuses on the needs of conscious entrepreneurs and social impact businesses. Prior to founding Awarepreneurs, Paul was the director of social media for Wisdom 2.0, one of the premier mindfulness brands in the world. He founded Awarepreneurs in 2017 because he saw the need for more honest conversation about the power of combining the power of conscious businesses and the dynamism of the social impact movement. Paul, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me, Angelo. I'm just honored to be here.
Paul, I always like to get started with these things by asking you, give me a sense of your early religious and spiritual background.
Well, I was raised in a Jewish household in the suburbs of New York City. And I wouldn't say we were it was a Reform background. So, my parents made my brother and I go to Sunday school. I was bar mitzvahed. And even more than the actual kind of religious or spiritual practice, we didn't light candles very often on Friday nights, but we certainly celebrated Hanukkah and Passover and other things like that. But the activist tradition that in Hebrew there's a word tikkun or tikkun olam, the healing that implies social justice and an awareness of social realities was very, very strong. The awareness of the how as humans living on planet Earth that the more progressive or activist wing of the Jewish tradition, that was something that was just embedded into my cells before I was born.
So the awareness was a part of that. I know I've talked to a lot of, I'll call them cultural Jews who basically had a background that didn't involve any awareness practices, all other than just the sort of communal activity of going to synagogue.
It changed I started in a fairly, I want to use the word cold, Reformed tradition. And then as my brother and I got into high school and I went off to college, my parents got involved in a much warmer, much more, let's reclaim the spiritual tradition. My brother and I sometimes joke about calling it hippie Judaism, the tradition of Zalman Schechter and the more like, how do we make spirituality there's deep spirituality in the Jewish tradition. It's a 5,000 plus year old tradition, but because of a lot of things, including oppression and killing off the leaders throughout many iterations of anti-Semitism and oppression, some of the deeper practices of Judaism went underground and they weren't so available to my parents and I. And in our lifetime, there's been a movement to kind of resurface some of the deep spiritual tradition in the Jewish movement, and my parents were very active of that, joined a Havurah and other, let's make this personal, and influenced my brother and I as we went into our 20s and our 30s.
So was the social activism piece always alive for you in terms of your upbringing, or did it sort of emerge?
I was certainly surrounded by it. My grandmother, when she was 80 years old, was organizing busloads of women. I think it was 2, maybe 3 busloads of women from New York City, where she lived, to Washington, Washington, D.C. for a march for in support of women's rights. And my mom was a really strong feminist. I remember when she went back to grad school at either 12, maybe 13, I read the book In a Different Voice by Carol Gilligan, a very strong feminist psychologist. That was part of my mom's master's level curriculum when she went back to school. So certainly, particularly feminism, and there's a very strong tradition of strong women in the Jewish tradition, and that was very much a part of my life. And then when I got into my late teens and early 20s, this was the time when Ronald Reagan was talking about winning nuclear war, and my peers and I were like, what? And I started my own kind of like, what does it look like to be a human being and live well on this planet? And I was deeply concerned, and took part in, getting educated with my own political awareness. And that was in my late teens that I started that.
It's really interesting. I remember growing up in the 60s, I guess, and, a lot of the activists were Jewish, basically. A lot of the people who were really kind of behind the civil rights movement and supporting it. And these days, I don't feel so much a connection between the Jewish community and the African American community as I do, I did back in those days.
Yeah, there's been a tension, growing up in New York. Historically, there's deep relationship. And if you look at the percentage of white people in the certain, think of Martin Luther King and who marched with Martin Luther King, the number of white people who were in those marches who were Jewish was off the charts disproportionate. And you look at organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center and other, social justice organizations, the founders are disproportionately Jewish. So there certainly has been, like I said, this phenomenon or this frame of tikkun. There's even a magazine called Tikkun.
Yeah, I know it.
It's a deep embedded awareness in certain Jewish lineages, and the idea of never again, the idea that the generation that went through the Holocaust and raised my generation, those a little bit earlier, my generation and a little bit later, that it was our job to be thinking about justice and be looking at oppression issues from literally the moment we were conceived. So it's in certain parts of the Jewish tradition, it's an alive and very strongly held belief.
Well, we're going to get into your current incarnation, I'll call it, with Awarepreneurs, but I want to go back a little bit, Paul. And I know that before you established yourself as a business and marketing coach, you were a social worker in where you are now in the Southwest. And I know that you did some work with Native peoples. And I wonder if that influenced you. What was it like working with Native peoples?
Oh, it influenced me profoundly, Angelo, deeply. So yeah, I grew up in the mostly white suburbs of New York City. And as I was starting to, I was finishing grad school, I got a master's degree in counseling psychology from Lesley University, which is 12 miles down the road from John Kabat-Zinn. If anybody knows mindfulness-based stress reduction and what's sometimes called the mindfulness movement now, John Kabat-Zinn is considered, one of the founders, and he is the founder of mindfulness-based stress reduction. My graduate program was deeply impacted by his work and other mindfulness researchers. We were 12 miles down the road from John Kabat-Zinn's house. So, again, that was also a very white, more privileged background. And when I was looking around in my, early 20s, where do I want to settle? Where do I want to live? Where do I go that I feel like there's a place that kind of matches some of my core values of community and creativity and living well and simply on the earth? New Mexico really stood out as I was having conversations about, who do I want to be as a young adult? And I had never been here before. I came out here. I've been to Colorado a number of times. I was also, and still am, deeply impacted, and nature is a huge part of one of my values, and having a meaningful relationship with nature. And so I was thinking, well, maybe I should move to Colorado. And several people said, don't go to Colorado. It's so white bread. Check out New Mexico. I had never been here before, right? And I came to this place in October of 1993, and I've never left.
Wow. So, I mean,
So,
tell me a little bit about the Native American piece. I know
oh
you
yeah,
yeah.
so I moved here. I had a master's degree in counseling psychology. In New Mexico, the licenses for being sort of a community health counselor and a social worker are very similar, and there's a lot of interchangeable. Uh, the license allows you to do some of both. So I got licensed as a community mental health counselor, and did a lot of community work. I was oftentimes the white guy with the degree that was allowing. I was really interested in community-based approaches in the juvenile justice world. That's often called restorative justice. In the child protection world, for younger kids, it's oftentimes called family group decision making. But the basic idea is that having circles of community think well about the needs of young people who are starting to be in trouble. So what I was really interested in is how can community find new pathways when there's been either legal issues or child protection issues. And New Mexico is proportionally the highest proportion of people of color in the United States as a state because of our large Hispanic and Native American or indigenous populations. So doing that work and those communities really resonated, as opposed to having a judge or having a social worker decide here's what should happen and be very prescriptive. And a lot of those prescriptions were, they were biased. They didn't mean to be, but our legal system is biased. So when you go into small communities that have experienced, economic inequality and lots of oppression, then you talk about empowering communities to deal with difficult situations to help their young people who are experiencing challenges do it in a way that's based on the values of that community and not the court system. We saw a lot of interest and a lot of excitement about that. And that was the work that took me into Native communities and these small Hispanic villages here in northern New Mexico. Those are my mentors. Those people really, they helped me unpack my privilege growing up as a, fairly privileged white Jewish young man in Westchester County, New York, some of the best public schools in the United States of America. I didn't earn that privilege. I didn't do anything to get those best public schools or a family that could afford a good sized house and 2 cars and lots of food and vacations. And I could see on the ground walking into the homes and these very tender, poignant situations where young people didn't have that kind of privilege. I was on the ground. It was my beeper that was going off at 2:00 in the morning sometimes. And the people in those villages were incredibly patient and generous to help me learn how to be more skillful in those environments that looked very, very different than the environments I grew up in.
I love the way that you introduce the word privilege into this conversation, and I know for myself I'm a person of color, but I'm also a male, and I find it quite a challenge to unpack my own male privilege in my relationships with women. And I'm just wondering, what's that been like? What's that process been like for you as a white male, basically?
It's been a lifelong journey, Angelo, that I'm still working on. Again, the idea of male privilege entered my consciousness quite young. Like I said, I was reading Carol Gilligan as 13 years old. And my mom was a very strong feminist. So, and actually early in my 20s, I got trained to do batterers intervention work and worked with a program called Men Overcoming Violence and did that work for many years, including the years as a social worker here in New Mexico. So, I've been working on this journey of unpacking the unearned privileges that I've got since, I was an early teenager, and I don't think I'm done yet.
Yeah, it's a lifelong thing. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
And I know that the Awarepreneurs is very much focused on integrating social justice work and awareness work. And I'm just wondering how you made that connection. It's not a common connection. Most people that they do awareness work, and it's just something they do with their group of people. They may or may not involve social justice work at all. And which is beautiful about Awarepreneurs is that you do this integration. So I'm wondering how, why you did that, how you did that, what led you to do that?
Well, after about 15 years of being in this community social work type work in New Mexico, I got burnt out, Angela. It was actually earlier than that. About year 10, year 11, I started to get a lot of compassion fatigue. It was beautiful work. It was hard work. We were dealing with, violence against children and domestic violence and intergenerational drug abuse and sexual abuse. Like, I was tired, let's say about year 11. I remember reading a book called The Therapist at Life as a Life Coach in about the year, gosh, when this must have been 13, 14 years ago when it was written. It might have been 2002. And I started hearing about coaching, and I just got tired of trying to come in after there had been some serious incident of violence or addiction, and started thinking, God, there's got to be a way that's not quite so hard. These situations, I was just tired, right? So I started hearing about coaching and going back to some of my roots in this training. I got this world-class training. I was at Lesley University. I started at Lesley in 1998 and graduated in 2000, right? No, I'm sorry. I got the, I started in 1989 and graduated in 1990. I'm sorry. So, I lost a decade there. This is very, very early on in the mindfulness movement, and I got a world-class education. I wanted to go back to that. I've seen how these tools, and I could talk about them more than average in these communities we were working, because they're really open and excited for innovative ideas, particularly ones that were resourced people on a spiritual level. The Catholic Church and the Hispanic communities is incredibly important here in New Mexico, and the Native spirituality here in New Mexico is also, like, if you weren't open to that, you didn't get on the res, or at least you didn't get any traction in any programs you were trying to launch. So there was some room for it, but again, a lot of the work was just like, this kid got a broken arm or was born as with cocaine in their system, and we need to do something about that right now. And that sort of immediate, just urgent safety needs, that was where some of the burnout was coming from, and I wanted to do more proactive work. So I went back to that mindfulness roots and started learning about coaching and started integrating mindfulness into my coaching practice that I launched now about 11 years ago.
I have a close friend who he was maybe the number 2 or 3 person at Omega Institute. Very good friend of mine. And,
I worked at Omega.
Oh, did
back
you?
in the day. I spent a summer there in 1988.
Well, you may or may not know my friend Jim DeLuca, who was did something there. Was number 3 person there at one time. But in any event, through knowing Jim and talking to him for a long time, I know that some of these environments like that, they're glamorous, but they also have sort of their downside, let's call it. So I guess the provocative question I want to ask you, Paul, what did you learn from your time at Wisdom 2.0, both pluses and minuses in terms of your interactions with that group, if you want to talk about it?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to talk about it. Wisdom 2.0 was started by a friend of mine who used to live here in New Mexico named Soren Gordhammer, and I was blessed to come on to that ride. That ride helped me go global. We got onto social media and started talking about conscious business and mindfulness in business settings early on in Twitter, when Twitter was a very small, kind of like subversive group of people, and the number of people talking about these issues on social media was very small. So suddenly we were like at Google learning about what now is called Search Inside Yourself, which is a program that's become global. And we were at Zappos talking about their positive psychology program. So we were learning about how people were bringing this into business way before it was common knowledge or there were any sort of writings about it. So I was blessed to be on the early wave of people who were thinking about this and in the dialogues, and I feel incredibly blessed. It's really helped me, form my marketing consulting business and, know many of the players who are leaders in this space. So I feel I'm excited about the movement, and I'm grateful to have gotten to ride that wave and to know some of the players, and it built my network from somebody who was like, I had no online anything, and my network were activists and social worker people in New Mexico. What I had a hard time with was those movements were extremely privileged based and very, very white. If you look at the last year I worked at Wisdom 2.0 and was very actively talking about this issue, there were 1,800 people at the conference, and there were something like 30 or 32 people of color in a community of 1,800 people. That it just got to the point where I couldn't not talk about that, especially given my mentors here in New Mexico who had invested so much in helping prepare me to cultivate and work in communities that were very, very diverse, because that's what New Mexico is. And the mindfulness movement and the dominant culture, the most visible spiritual movement, like at a place called the Omega Institute, which I worked at. I know what it looks like. I know I was in the kitchen for the summer in 1888. Those communities, those workshops were almost, entirely white people. And I really got frustrated with that.
It's quite interesting. It's like it's sort of like the people of color in those organizations are sort of fetishized. So you have like those Indian gurus and people like that come from it, but the actual participation is most overwhelmingly white. I'm not so sure that's a bad thing. It's just the way it is. And what is your sense as to why a lot of most I'll call them American spiritual organizations are overwhelmingly Caucasian? Why is that?
I think there's a history in the more spiritual, at least the more visible spiritual communities, where in circles I movement, it would be called spiritual bypass. Like there's some really uncomfortable social realities. We're seeing them with the Trump administration. We're seeing them kind of come to the forefront. And things that have been operating underneath the surface or not everybody's been aware of are suddenly things like, whoa, look what's happening here, right? But that awareness, that consciousness has been in operation for generations. And some of the discomfort that we feel, some of us living on planet Earth, that we reach to spiritual practice for, it's supposed to be there. Let me say that again, Angelo. It's supposed to be there because we're living in unsustainable ways, in so many ways, socially, environmentally, economically. Our economics is built on inequality and oppression. It's not a stable, life-enhancing set of systems that we have. And so the huge percentage of humans on planet Earth right now that are dealing with anxiety or depression or just a sense of like, wow, I'm not really living my purpose, there's something wrong, and I don't have full language for what that is. That's our innate wisdom saying there's some things that are wrong with the systemic ways humans are living on planet Earth. And some forms of spirituality are trying to say, oh, don't worry about that. I've got this great meditation technique or some energy psychology practice or some modality that's going to make you comfortable and make that all go away. And there's a reason so many of us are uncomfortable, but those reasons are uncomfortable to talk about. You know that,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. You've been doing this work for how many decades?
Wow. So tell me a little bit about, maybe a good way to address this. I want to get to your recent issues with the Awarepreneur network. So let's just talk about that for a little bit. You had this sort of vibrant network. You still do. I think at one time there was more like 2,000 people or something. Is that correct? The correct number that were involved in Awarepreneurs?
We were up about 2,700 people.
That's a lot of people. I mean, it's amazing that you were able to create such a community. And a few things happened to cause you to go back to your principles in terms of how you founded the network. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that in the context that we just talked about in terms of the difficulties some people who are otherwise aware have difficulty just dealing with the aspects of privilege and social justice.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we experienced kind of a perfect storm of time to evolve, right? Perfect storm is some of the things that are happening in the larger collective. We've seen, this is not just somebody's, vague sense. But due to organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center, we know that we can count more hate crimes. They're just happening more often right now. And the visibility of some of the hatred we're seeing, the sexism we're seeing with the sexual harassment, sexual assault coming forth, right? We know that those incidents, at least in the hate, we saw that with Charlottesville, that the hate crimes are, people who are involved in hate groups are getting emboldened by certain things that are happening politically. And people of color who are care about spirituality and were looking for a home started seeing in Awarepreneurs. We were talking about this stuff, and so it's been embedded in our core values since way before Awarepreneurs ever existed. But when Awarepreneurs was launched, I very explicitly made social justice one of our core values, and we talk about it a lot, and that helped us attract a much more diverse membership than most visible, modern, more American-based spiritual communities. And a lot of the white people in our community weren't used to these conversations. So that was one of the things that were happening. At the same time, several communities, but one particular sister community that had a social justice conscious business experience, it kind of blew up. And I won't go into the details. It's way beyond the focus of this podcast. But there was a lot of energy around people of color, particularly women of color, having to do a lot of the just heavy lifting. Either they had to accept unconscious bias and white supremacy-based beliefs, or they had to do a lot of unpaid labor to help educate the people in the community the white people in the community who weren't used to having these conversations. And also due to the political things that are happening in the larger collective, those people of color in many communities like Awarepreneurs were just feeling really angry and frustrated, and were tired of having to do that kind of labor. So all of that kind of led to, we were seeing some posts being done and white people getting triggered, and some things that were asking for a more refined sense of moderation and container. So we can talk about what those changes are, but the situation was we were having really heated conversations with a very large group of people, and many of our white members had never experienced anything like that before, and were saying and doing some very unskillful things.
It's very interesting. You talked about some people that are involved in what we'll call spirituality. There's this kind of spirituality which is kind of like, it's almost like a silo. I just want to do my meditation. I don't want to do anything else. I mean, I'm maybe mischaracterizing it. You could say the same thing with entrepreneurs in a way. It's like all this stuff is going on. I just want to focus on my business. I don't want to deal with this society stuff or whatever. It's almost analogous in a certain sense.
Absolutely. We talk about it, or I talk about it very explicitly, Angelo, that if you look at the name Awarepreneurs, right, the awareness, more spiritual or mindfulness movement, and the other parent lineage of Awarepreneurs is the entrepreneur movement. Those two lineages, I believe, are some of the most powerful forces on the planet right now. I really believe that. And at least in the United States, they both have done a very poor job historically fostering diversity and inclusion. So we have two parent lineages, both of them. And, I can give you numbers. I told you I worked at the, Omega Institute, and I worked for Wisdom 2.0. I know those brands. I could tell you how many people are sitting in the room in those, experiences. And then if you just take a look at who gets funded in the entrepreneur movement, right? Funding is critical. We're talking about startup capital, and women and people of color are vastly underfunded, in comparison to white men funded startups. So there's a lot. This isn't just theory. This is, on the ground, real world. There is a massive problem in both of our parent lineages, and you put them together, it's a very, very exciting combination, this intersection of conscious business and awareness practices and social impact. But there's also a history of not paying good attention, and that I wanted to, when I started Awarepreneurs, put that front and center, just say, okay, these are really powerful change technologies and traditions. And we haven't done a good job in this community. We're going to work to make this something we put front and center. And if someone's uncomfortable with that, that's fine. You get to decide. Do you want to hang in there and be uncomfortable? We'll do our best to provide resources and ways of dialoguing and all sorts of great leaders in our new advisory board, which you're on, and there's things we're going to be doing there. I'm so excited to have you and honored to have you. We're really going to work hard to create resources and containers, and we're not going to shy away from this. Our parent lineages have not done a good job, and as the next generation, so to speak, we're going to try to do some of the work that our parent and grandparent in this lineage didn't know how to do.
So we've been talking about the social justice piece, but I want to talk a little bit about entrepreneurship, Paul. And I know that you have a strong belief in entrepreneurship as a vehicle for social change. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, the really simple version is, in a modern economy, right? Awareness teachers tell us that our single most powerful asset we have as human beings is our attention. You can look at, Jewish leaders say that, and Buddhist leaders say that, and Christian leaders say that, and Muslim leaders. Like, our attention is an incredibly valuable asset. And in a modern economy, the majority of us spend the majority of our waking hours working. Right? I love my daughter. I have spent more time in her lifetime working than I've spent with my daughter. I love my friends. I love my girlfriend. I love my parents, right? You just look at the sheer number of hours that we spend working. And I spend less than many entrepreneurs or many people. I'm just really blessed that I get to work for myself, and I try to be a kind boss, right? I work hard, but I think I spend less than what, some people in a modern economy do. So we have this incredible concentration of human attention in what we do for our work. And if our work is not lined up, this is what started to happen to me when I was burning out as a social worker. I just saw the incredible amount of human suffering and the wasted just human energy, our attention, our single most valuable resource, being put into work that didn't align with our values, or at a best case scenario was like, first of all, do no harm. At best case, it was value neutral. If we could shift the experience of the majority of adult humans on planet Earth so that we felt like what we were doing when we went to work was aligned with our values, imagine what that world would look like. I got obsessed with that. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. I literally wake up in the middle of the night dreaming about it. That question has formed, the past 12 years of my life.
Tell me a little bit about your, let's say, role models on this path toward integrating entrepreneurship and social change.
That's a great question, Angelo. I've had to kind of piece it together. And so in some ways, I've been blessed with incredibly skillful social justice, social change activists, starting way back when I was in college, in people who were looking at how we could organize and use things like circle-based technologies, or restorative justice, and an award-winning professor named Dr. Don DeMott at State University of New York at Geneseo. I'm going way back to like 1986, and some of my other professors. And going forward, more personal to me was a man named Stephen Botkin, who helped me around doing men's work, and particularly around ending men's violence and working on rape culture, which was some of my first paid activist work right out of grad school, or actually even when I was still in grad school. And then my mentors here in New Mexico that I mentioned earlier. And then the business mentoring, because I was coming in through the lens of this conscious business movement and then eventually went to work for Wisdom 2.0. I've sat down and I personally met with Tony Hsieh, the leader of Zappos, on the day that Zappos was handing out T-shirts to their employees. They thank you for making us $1 billion a year company. I've gotten to sit in the room and have conversations with some incredibly skilled business people who care about awareness and positive psychology practices. The number of people who are putting them together, that 10, 12 years ago when I was reinventing myself, I didn't know. Now I know a lot. But back in the day, there were these two somewhat kind of divergent lineages of awareness and consciousness and social justice and business. And there were some people who were trying to sync those up, but I didn't know them very well, and they weren't very far along. We've made a lot of progress in the last 10 or 12 years.
Yeah, and you're an exemplar of the progress that you've made in the last 10 or 12 years in terms of the we and the Paul.
Well, I've gotten to, I've tried, like I said, I have a master's degree basically in awareness-based human behavior from, when I was in Boston in 1989, Angelo. John Kabat-Zinn was 13 miles down the road in one direction. Herbert Benson, who wrote the book, The Relaxation Response, he was at Harvard. If you've ever talked about the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous systems, you're standing on his shoulders, and his research he did at Harvard. Joan Borisenko, who's doing a lot of work around mindfulness and women's behavioral and medical changes. She now actually lives in New Mexico, but she was at MIT. I was in this hot, I've been blessed with a lot of privilege and also just kind of winding up in the right place at the right time, living across the horse pasture from the guy who started Wisdom 2.0. That just happened. So, talking to Tony Hsieh and going to Google before there ever was a book or anything public about Search Inside Yourself and talking to the people there, I've been blessed. And, one of the 13 grandmothers, somebody who I've done a lot of work with, and here in New Mexico, Kathy Sanchez. So I've just been blessed with incredible people who've gone really, really deep in these areas. And I think the universe has invited me to think about synthesis. And I've said yes to doing the best I know how to do about that.
Well, I'm sure happy that you have, Paul, and you're definitely passing it on, all the different things that you've been taught by all of your teachers. And I'm wondering, I read the paper, the New York Times, and often I just get depressed. It's like, what are we doing, or what am I doing? And I ask myself every day, what can I do to keep myself grounded? And I do what little I can to keep myself grounded. So I'm just wondering what your practice is. How do you keep yourself grounded spiritually?
I have several practices that have been with me long term, namely an awareness-based meditation practice and yoga. I've been doing yoga for a long, long time. And more recently, it's a relational practice. I'm blessed to be in an incredible relationship with a wonderful woman named Andrea, and somebody helped me. Another, actually, Awarepreneurs advisory board member talked about her relationship with her husband as one of her premier relational spiritual practices. And the way Andrea and I work and how we support each other, and she's somebody who's also been on an awareness journey for decades. So these days, I just bow in her direction and how we are with each other, and how she's helped me bring more of a sense of relationality to my spiritual practice, not just me being alone on my yoga mat, although that's really important. But it's being in relationship with people like Andrea, and I have a men's group that's a deep part of my life that I love the guys in my men's group. And so the relational practices have become more important as I age, and also as I look what's going on our planet and say, I could sit on my cushion for the rest of my life. At some point, I need to figure out what Joanna Macy and Thich Nhat Hanh, they call it interbeing. What are the relational spiritual practices that are going to help us live on this planet with nature and each other in a sustainable way? I've gotten kind of obsessed about that part of the spiritual pool.
Wow, that's wonderful. I just love this word, relational spirituality. It's a very, very, very important piece of it. That people will use the word spiritual. Also, it seems like kind of like a solipsistic kind of thing, and the relational piece is that's what really activates it in a certain way. It couldn't be activated any other way.
It's become more important as I've gotten older, for sure.
So, Paul, this has just been a wonderful conversation. I certainly have gotten a lot out of it. How would you tell people if they wanted to reach you or find out more about Awarepreneurs or your work? How could they go about doing that?
We have a website for Awarepreneurs. You can go to awarepreneurs.com and check out specifically the community part. That's the relational practice where we, a diverse, deep dive community that's looking at the intersection of conscious business, social entrepreneurship, social impact, and the social justice piece. So feel free to take a look at that, awarepreneurs.com. If you're interested in the marketing consulting and the business consulting I do, I have a website, just my name, paulzelizer.com, and that's where you can find out about that work.
Paul, again, thank you so much. And anybody who please join us in Awarepreneurs. I'm privileged to be a member of it myself, and it's been very nurturing for me in my brief time involved in it. And if you are interested in this podcast or supporting it, please go to Patreon, look for Diversity and Spirituality Network. Also, you can look for Awarepreneurs there. You can support both of us if you like. And please have a blessed day. And again, Paul, thank you so much for participating.
Thank you so much for having me, Angela. I think I might have been one of your first 3 supporters on the Patreon. I love what you're doing. I was so excited to find you, just a deep out for what you're doing here.
Thank you, brother. Talk to you soon.
What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is spirituality? Spirituality. Spirituality. How do they diver? How do they diver? How do they diver? How do they convert? How do they convert? How do they convert? How do they convert? How are we different?